Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you don't want to do the thing you used to love. Not because something terrible happened, not because you failed, but because somewhere along the way, the energy just ran out. The passion you built your entire routine around stopped feeling like passion and started feeling like pressure. And the worst part is, you can't explain it. You didn't change. You're still doing the same work. But something underneath shifted in a way you can't quite name. This is one of the most confusing forms of mental exhaustion a person can experience because it breaks the logic we were taught. We were told that if you love what you do, you'll never burn out. That burnout is something that happens to people stuck in jobs they hate, in environments that drain them. But that's not the full picture. Burnout doesn't just attack miserable people. It attacks dedicated ones, passionate ones, people who care deeply. And understanding why that happens requires going below the surface, past the motivational explanations, and into the actual mechanics of how the brain operates under sustained mental effort. Burnout, at its core, is not an emotional problem. It is a neurological one. The brain is not designed for infinite output. It operates on a system of resources, and those resources have limits. When those limits are consistently ignored, the brain doesn't just get tired in the way your muscles do after exercise. It begins to restructure its own responses. It starts pulling back. It reduces its willingness to engage. It becomes, in a very real biological sense, resistant to the very activity that once felt rewarding. This is not weakness. This is the brain doing exactly what it was built to do, protecting itself. To understand how this works, it's important to understand the role dopamine plays in sustained effort. Dopamine is often simplified as the pleasure chemical, but that framing misses its deeper function. Dopamine is primarily a motivation molecule. It's what drives you toward things, what creates the internal momentum to begin tasks, to push through difficulty, to stay engaged. When you first fall in love with something, whether that's writing, coding, music, running, design, whatever it might be, your dopamine system responds powerfully. It reinforces the behavior. It creates the feeling that this matters, that this is worth your time. That internal signal is incredibly strong in the beginning, but here's what most people don't know. Dopamine doesn't respond to the reward itself. It responds to the expectation of the reward. And when the reward becomes predictable, when success becomes routine, the dopamine signal begins to flatten. This is called dopamine habituation. The brain stops treating familiar outcomes as exciting. The same work that once felt electrically alive starts to feel flat. And from the outside, this looks like burnout. But from the inside of the brain, it's actually just adaptation. The nervous system is treating something repeated as something no longer novel, no longer worth the full neurological response. This is why even people doing work they genuinely care about can start feeling disconnected from it. It's not that the passion was fake. It's that the brain stopped signaling it with the same chemical intensity it once did. And without that internal signal, effort feels heavier. Focus becomes harder to sustain. The work that once felt like flow starts to feel like friction. There's another layer to this that most people completely overlook, and it has to do with how modern digital life interacts with the brain's attention system. The average person today is not just working. They're working while surrounded by an environment designed to interrupt them. Notifications, social media feeds, emails, short-form video content. All of these are engineered to produce quick, high-frequency dopamine hits. They're designed by people who understand the brain's reward system extremely well. And when you spend hours consuming fast stimulation, you're training your brain's baseline for what counts as engaging. You're raising the threshold. The result is that when you sit down to do your actual work, even work you love, your brain is now comparing it to a feed that updates every 3 seconds. Deep work, creative work, analytical work, all of it requires slower, more sustained attention. But a brain that has been conditioned on rapid stimulation doesn't settle easily into that slower pace. It feels restless. It reaches for the phone. It struggles to stay in the work for more than a few minutes at a time. This isn't laziness. This is the brain's attention system responding to a mismatch between its current stimulation expectations and what the environment is actually offering. Over time, this mismatch compounds. You start doing your work in a fragmented way, constantly context switching, never fully entering the focused state where meaningful output happens. The quality drops. The experience of doing the work becomes more frustrating and less satisfying. And because satisfaction is what sustains long-term engagement, you begin to associate the work with discomfort rather than reward. The brain is learning the wrong lesson. It's being trained to avoid depth rather than seek it. Cognitive load is another mechanism that drives burnout in ways that often go unrecognized. Every decision, every mental task, every moment of self-regulation draws on the same limited pool of mental energy. Psychologists call this depletion of executive function. When you make dozens of small decisions throughout the day, when you regulate your emotions, manage your schedule, monitor your performance, respond to social expectations, you're drawing from the same well that creative and intellectual work requires. And that well has a daily capacity. It refills with rest. But most people are not getting genuine rest. Rest doesn't mean passive consumption. Scrolling through social media is not rest. It's low-effort stimulation, which means the brain is still processing. The default mode network, which is responsible for restoration, insight, and emotional processing, needs genuine quiet to operate. It needs time without input. Most people today never give their brains that silence. They move from work stimulation to digital stimulation with no actual decompression in between. So the cognitive resources that would normally recover never fully do. And each day, the deficit gets a little deeper. This is where burnout transitions from a short-term fatigue to a long-term state. When cognitive resources are depleted consistently over weeks and months, the brain starts to reorganize its priorities. It reduces its allocation to tasks that are demanding. It increases avoidance behavior. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, focus, and sustained effort, becomes less responsive. And the limbic system, the emotional center, which includes the brain's threat detection circuitry, becomes more dominant. This is why burnout often comes with emotional symptoms like irritability, anxiety, and a general sense of dread. The brain has shifted into a kind of protective withdrawal. Now here's where it gets psychologically interesting. When someone is deeply identified with their work, when their sense of self is tied to what they produce, burnout becomes more than exhaustion. It becomes an identity crisis. If you are someone who writes and you can no longer write with the same energy, you don't just feel tired. You feel like you're failing at being yourself. This is a particular kind of psychological suffering because the solution that might otherwise seem obvious, rest, stepping back, reducing output, feels threatening to the self-concept. It feels like giving up on who you are. The brain under this kind of identity pressure doesn't rest easily. It keeps pushing. It interprets rest as failure. It treats slowness as a threat to identity. And so the person continues to drive themselves into the work, even as the brain is clearly signaling that it needs recovery. This is the mechanism behind what some researchers call overextension burnout. It's not driven by external pressure alone. It's driven by internal psychological pressure tied to self-worth and identity. The harder part is that people in this pattern often look dedicated and disciplined from the outside. But internally, they are running on cognitive reserves they don't have. There's also the matter of autonomy and meaning erosion. Even in work you love, when the context shifts, when external expectations increase, when the audience grows, when performance metrics become the focus, when money enters the equation, the psychological relationship with the work changes. What started as an intrinsically motivated activity gradually becomes extrinsically evaluated. Research in behavioral psychology, particularly work rooted in self-determination theory, consistently shows that when external rewards begin to overshadow internal motivation, the quality of engagement drops. The brain's reward system responds differently to obligation than it does to curiosity. And over time, work that once felt self-directed starts to feel like a job, even if you technically chose every part of it. So what does the brain actually need? Not motivation, not inspiration, not a productivity system. The brain needs what it was designed to run on, which is genuine variation in stimulation, consistent recovery, and a clear signal that effort leads to meaningful progress. These three things address the underlying mechanisms rather than just the surface symptoms. Variation matters because the dopamine system responds to novelty. Introducing new problems, new angles, new forms of engagement within work you love can partially restore the neurological signal that made the work feel rewarding in the first place. This is not about changing careers. It's about reintroducing enough cognitive novelty to re-engage the motivation system. Recovery means more than sleep, though sleep is genuinely one of the most powerful neurological restoration tools available. It also means intentional periods where the brain is not processing input. Walks without audio. Stillness. Unstructured time. These are not luxuries. They are biological requirements for the prefrontal cortex to reset and for the default mode network to do its restorative work. Progress signals matter because the brain's reward system is goal-oriented. When progress is invisible or unmeasured, motivation erodes. Creating small, visible markers of completion gives the brain what it needs to produce the internal signals that sustain engagement. But above all of this, what the brain needs most is for you to stop treating it like a machine. The deepest cause of burnout in people who love their work is a fundamental misunderstanding of how human attention and motivation actually function. The belief that passion is fuel that doesn't run out. That loving something means it should always feel good. That needing rest is a personal failure. These beliefs are not just wrong. They are neurologically counterproductive. They push people past the signals their own biology sends them, and they create the very exhaustion they were trying to avoid. Understanding burnout at this level changes the way you relate to it. It stops being a sign that something is wrong with you, and it starts being a sign that something is working correctly. Your brain hit a limit. It sent a signal. The signal was fatigue, disconnection, resistance. Not weakness, not failure. Biology doing its job. The question is whether you're willing to listen to it before it forces the issue in ways you can't ignore. The most sustainable relationship with any work, even work you love, is one where you respect the brain's operating conditions rather than override them. Where you build recovery into the rhythm rather than treating it as a reward for when you've done enough. Where you understand that depth of engagement comes in cycles, not in a straight line of constant output. The people who last in creative and intellectual work for decades are not the ones with the most passion. They're the ones who learned how the brain actually works and built their routines around that understanding instead of fighting it.